When Jake "Thunder" Morrison pulled his Harley over on Route 47 that rainy Tuesday morning, nobody expected what would happen next. The towering biker, with arms covered in tattoos and a beard that hadn't seen a razor in months, wasn't exactly the type you'd picture rescuing anything. But there they were, two tiny golden retriever puppies, no bigger than his fists, shivering beside their mother who hadn't made it through the night. The sight of this mountain of a man gently scooping up those helpless pups sent ripples through Millbrook. At Murphy's diner, folks whispered and chuckled. At the hardware store, old-timers shook their heads. Everyone was certain those puppies wouldn't last a week with Thunder. But what nobody in that small town realized was that sometimes the biggest hearts come in the most unexpected packages. What would Thunder do that would change everything everyone thought they knew about him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thunder Morrison had never been a man of many words, but his hands told stories that his voice never would. In the dim light of his garage workshop, those same massive hands that had once assembled rifles in the dusty mountains of Afghanistan now delicately adjusted the carburetor on a 1973 shovelhead. The irony wasn't lost on him that the steadiest part of his body was also the part that had seen the most violence. His father's dog tags hung heavy around his neck, tucked beneath a faded black t-shirt that had seen better decades. Staff Sergeant William Morrison had died when Thunder was 17, leaving behind only these metal remnants and a legacy of duty that felt more like a burden than a blessing. The tags clinked softly against his chest as he worked, a constant reminder of expectations he'd never quite managed to fulfill. Morrison's garage sat on 3 acres at the edge of Millbrook, far enough from Main Street that most folks only ventured out when their bikes needed serious work. Thunder preferred it that way. The business sustained him adequately, if not lavishly. His reputation for motorcycle repair was unquestioned. His ability to resurrect even the most hopeless machines bordered on mythical. But his reputation for conversation was considerably less impressive. The garage itself reflected its owner's practical nature. Tools hung in precise rows, each having earned its place through years of reliable service. A small apartment above the shop served as Thunder's living quarters, sparse but clean, decorated only with a few motorcycle magazines and a single framed photograph of his army unit. Their faces young and optimistic in ways that made his chest tighten whenever he caught sight of it. Thunder's daily routine rarely varied. Up at dawn, coffee black and strong, then downstairs to lose himself in the mechanical poetry of engines and transmissions. Lunch was usually a sandwich eaten standing over whatever bike demanded his attention. Evenings meant more work, or sometimes a solitary ride through the mountain roads that surrounded Millbrook like protective arms. The townspeople respected him, certainly. When old Mrs. Henderson's ancient Honda refused to start, she called Thunder. When the sheriff's department needed their patrol bikes serviced, they brought them to Morrison's. But respect and friendship were different currencies entirely, and Thunder had learned long ago that he was wealthy in one and bankrupt in the other. His isolation hadn't happened overnight. 3 failed relationships, each ending with some variation of, "You're just not here, Jake, even when you're sitting right next to me," had taught him that some wounds heal better in solitude. The last woman, Jennifer, had lasted almost 2 years before finally admitting that loving someone who kept their heart locked away was like trying to warm yourself with a photograph of fire. That had been 4 years ago. Since then, Thunder had constructed his life like one of his motorcycles, functional, reliable, and designed to run solo. He attended town events when politeness demanded it, nodded to neighbors when their paths crossed, and maintained the careful distance that kept everyone safe from the darkness he carried. But this morning, with 2 tiny lives depending on him, that carefully constructed isolation was about to face its greatest test. Millbrook had seen better days, though most residents would argue it had seen worse ones too. The welcome sign at the town's edge bore testament to both claims. Faded blue paint proclaimed Millbrook, where everyone knows your name in cheerful letters, but the bullet holes scattered across the metal told a different story. Those holes came from teenage pranks during the recession years, when half the storefronts stood empty and hope was as scarce as decent-paying jobs. Murphy's Diner anchored Main Street like a lighthouse in a storm, its neon sign flickering with the persistence of a heartbeat. Inside, red vinyl booths held the accumulated wisdom and gossip of 3 generations. Patrick Murphy, a man whose Irish accent had survived 40 years in Montana mountains, served coffee strong enough to wake the dead and pie that could make a grown man weep. His establishment operated as the town's unofficial city hall, where disputes were settled over breakfast and news traveled faster than wildfire. Dr. Sarah Chen had arrived 5 years ago, fresh from veterinary school and carrying dreams of rural practice bigger than her student loan debt. Her clinic occupied a converted house on Maple Street, complete with a hand-painted sign that proclaimed all creatures great and small in elegant script. Sarah's gentle manner with animals was matched only by her fierce determination to prove that a young woman could thrive in a profession traditionally dominated by gruff older men. The fact that she was also the only single woman under 40 within 50 miles had not escaped the notice of Millbrook's eligible bachelor's. Sheriff Tom Bradley represented the law with the easy confidence of a man who'd grown up knowing every family secret in town. His patrol car spent more time parked outside Murphy's than on actual patrol. But serious crime was as rare as snow in July. Tom's biggest challenges usually involved breaking up fights between rival high school football teams or mediating disputes between neighbors over property lines and wandering livestock. The economic heart of Millbrook beat steadily but slowly. Peterson's Hardware had survived 3 recessions by extending credit when times got tough and accepting payment in everything from firewood to fresh vegetables. The post office doubled as a social center where Mrs. Eleanor Fitzgerald dispensed stamps, packages, and unsolicited advice with equal efficiency. 2 gas stations competed for the modest traffic that passed through on Highway 47. Their rivalry so ingrained that families were expected to choose sides and stick with them through generations. But beneath Millbrook's friendly facade lay the complicated dynamics of any small community. Everyone indeed knew everyone's name, along with their business, their failures, and their secrets. Kindness and judgment flowed from the same wells. The same neighbors who would organize food drives for struggling families would also whisper about those families' financial decisions for months. Afterward, Thunder Morrison occupied a unique position in this social ecosystem. His military service earned him respect. His mechanical skills made him valuable, but his emotional distance kept him forever on the periphery. People trusted him with their motorcycles and their sheriff department contracts, but not with their personal confidences or their dinner invitations. The town had watched him return from overseas 7 years ago, had witnessed his failed attempts at normal relationships, and had gradually accepted his preference for solitude. They'd grown comfortable with Thunder as the reliable outsider, the man who fixed things but didn't get involved, who could be counted on for excellent work and minimal conversation. This comfortable arrangement had served everyone well. Thunder got the space he needed to heal from wounds that never quite closed, and Millbrook got a skilled mechanic who didn't complicate their social dynamics. But this morning's discovery would test whether that careful balance could survive the introduction of 2 small creatures who knew nothing about maintaining appropriate distances. The muddy blanket in Thunder's hands had seen better days. Originally navy blue, it now bore the stains of countless garage projects, oil changes, and the inevitable accumulation of a working man's life. He'd grabbed it from the back of his truck without thinking, wrapping the 2 shivering puppies in its rough warmth as rain continued to fall around them. Standing there on Route 47, Thunder felt the weight of an impossible decision settling on his shoulders like a familiar burden. The practical part of his mind, the part that had kept him alive through 3 tours of duty, catalogued all the reasons this was a terrible idea. He worked 12-hour days. His apartment barely had room for 1 person, let alone 2 energetic animals. Veterinary bills, food costs, training, the inevitable destruction that came with puppies. His carefully ordered life had no space for chaos. And puppies were chaos incarnate. But the larger of the 2 pups had stopped shivering and was looking up at him with eyes that seemed far too wise for something so small. The smaller one had fallen asleep against his chest, tiny body rising and falling, with breath so delicate they felt like whispers against his shirt. Thunder had held dying soldiers with more weight to them than these 2 scraps of life. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "Son, a man's worth isn't measured by what he can carry, but by what he's willing to carry." Staff Sergeant Morrison had been talking about military gear at the time. But standing in the rain with 2 orphaned animals, Thunder understood the deeper meaning for the first time. The mother dog lay still beside the road, her golden coat matted with rain and mud. She'd been beautiful once, probably someone's beloved pet who'd either escaped or been abandoned. The collar around her neck bore no tags, no identification, just a worn leather strip that spoke of love without ownership. Her final act had been giving birth beside this lonely stretch of highway, ensuring her babies had at least a chance. Thunder found himself thinking about chances, about the randomness of survival. He'd come home from Afghanistan when better men hadn't. He'd walked away from IED explosions that should have killed him. He'd received his honorable discharge while friends remained buried in foreign soil. For 7 years he'd questioned why he'd been spared, what purpose his continued existence served. Maybe this was it. Maybe 2 abandoned puppies on a rainy Tuesday morning were the answer to a question he'd been afraid to ask. The decision, when it finally came, felt less like choosing and more like surrendering. Thunder carefully tucked the blanket tighter around the small bodies, feeling their trust settle into his chest like a key finding its lock. His truck's engine rumbled to life, windshield wipers clearing the rain in steady arcs as he pulled back onto the highway. He didn't think about the money he didn't have or the experience he lacked. He didn't consider the opinions of Millbrook's residents or the complications these 2 lives would bring to his carefully structured existence. For the first time in years, Thunder Morrison acted purely on instinct, on the simple recognition that sometimes salvation came disguised as responsibility. The muddy blanket that held them had covered motorcycle engines and camping gear, had served as everything from a picnic covering to emergency first aid. But wrapping those 2 puppies, giving them warmth and protection when they had nothing else in the world, might have been its most important job yet. The old shoebox had once contained Thunder's work boots, sturdy, steel-toed companions that had served him well for 3 years before finally surrendering to the inevitable wear of garage floors and gravel driveways. Now lined with an old towel that smelled faintly of motor oil and detergent, it represented his first fumbling attempt at creating a home for 2 lives that depended entirely on his improvisation. Thunder set the makeshift bed in the corner of his apartment, as far from the radiator as possible, but close enough to his own bed that he could hear any distress calls during the night. The logistics of puppy care had never crossed his mind before this morning, and the learning curve felt steeper than mastering advanced motorcycle electronics. The smaller puppy, barely larger than his palm, seemed content to sleep curled against its sibling. But the larger one kept trying to climb out of the shoebox, tiny claws scratching against cardboard walls as determination outweighed coordination. Thunder found himself sitting cross-legged on his apartment floor, gently returning the escape artist to safety every few minutes while trying to research puppy care on his ancient laptop. Internet searches revealed a bewildering array of requirements: specific feeding schedules, temperature control, socialization needs, vaccination protocols. The websites assumed a level of preparation Thunder distinctly lacked. His kitchen contained coffee, frozen dinners, and the basic ingredients for emergency sandwiches. Puppy milk replacer was notably absent from his inventory. A trip to Peterson's hardware proved partially helpful. Old Pete himself emerged from behind the counter, eyebrows rising as Thunder explained his unexpected situation. The store carried basic pet supplies for the ranchers and farmers who made up much of their clientele, but nothing specifically designed for newborn puppies. You might want to try the feed store over in Cascade, Pete suggested, his weathered hands already reaching for a notebook. But for tonight, Mrs. Peterson always said goat's milk works in a pinch. Got some in the refrigerated section we keep for the bottle callers. Thunder left with goat's milk, a small bottle with a makeshift nipple, and Pete's wife's phone number written on a scrap of paper. She raised 6 kids and more animals than I can count, Pete explained. If anyone knows about feeding tiny critters, it's Martha. Back in his apartment, Thunder attempted his first feeding. The process proved more complex than anticipated. The puppies seemed unimpressed with his technique, milk dribbling down their tiny chins as they struggled to coordinate sucking and swallowing. Thunder's patience, developed through years of delicate mechanical work, served him well as he adjusted angles and pressure until both puppies managed to consume something approaching a meal. The shoebox became command central for their care. Thunder arranged towels for different purposes, dry ones for sleeping, damp ones for cleaning, spare ones for the inevitable accidents. His methodical nature usually applied to organizing tools and parts, found new purpose in creating systems for feeding times, cleaning schedules, and monitoring the puppy's progress. As evening approached, Thunder realized his apartment had been transformed. The sterile efficiency of his living space now contained the unmistakable signs of life, the soft sounds of puppy breathing, the faint smell of milk and animal warmth, the visible evidence of care in the carefully arranged shoebox nest. He sat beside them as darkness fell, watching their tiny bodies rise and fall with sleep. The larger puppy had finally settled, one small paw draped over its sibling in a gesture that made Thunder's chest tighten unexpectedly. These weren't just animals he was caring for. They were becoming something more, something that made his carefully controlled world feel suddenly larger and more dangerous. The shoebox that held them represented everything Thunder had never allowed himself to want, something fragile that needed protection, something small that could grow into something meaningful, something that transformed utility into love through the simple act of caring. Dr. Sarah Chen's stethoscope had belonged to her grandfather, a country veterinarian who'd spent 50 years treating everything from prize bulls to parakeets in rural California. The worn leather earpieces and slightly tarnished chest piece carried the weight of countless diagnoses, and Sarah often felt her grandfather's steady presence when she placed it against an animal's chest. This morning, as she examined Thunder Morrison's unexpected charges, that familiar weight felt particularly significant. Thunder sat in the corner of the examination room, his massive frame looking oddly vulnerable as he watched Sarah's every movement. She'd known him peripherally for the 5 years she'd practiced in Millbrook, had seen him at town events where he stood quietly at the edges, polite but distant. She'd never imagined him as someone who would rescue abandoned animals. "How long since they've eaten?" Sarah asked, her fingers gently palpating the smaller puppy's abdomen. The little one was clearly the weaker of the two, ribs visible through golden fur that should have been fuller. "About 2 hours. Had trouble getting them to take the milk at first." Thunder's voice carried the careful precision he applied to mechanical problems, but Sarah caught the underlying worry he was trying to hide. The stethoscope revealed what she'd suspected. Both puppies were dehydrated and underweight, but their hearts beat strong and steady. No signs of the heart murmurs that often plagued puppy mill dogs. No indication of serious congenital problems. They were survivors, like the man who'd found them. "They're maybe 6 weeks old," Sarah said, switching to the larger puppy. This one squirmed more, showing the feistiness that would serve him well. "Old enough to start weaning, but they've been through trauma, losing their mother, exposure to cold and rain. They're going to need careful monitoring for the next few weeks. Thunder leaned forward slightly. What kind of monitoring? Sarah found herself studying his face as she explained feeding schedules, weight tracking, vaccination protocols. His attention was absolute, the same focused intensity she'd observed when he worked on motorcycles. But this was different. This was personal in a way that motorcycle repair never could be. The smaller one is going to need extra attention, she continued, running her hands along tiny limbs. She's weaker, probably wasn't getting enough nutrition even before. You'll need to supplement her feeding. Maybe wake up during the night to make sure she's eating enough. Something shifted in Thunder's expression, a softening around his eyes that Sarah had never seen before. She? Both females, actually. Sisters, I'd guess. Sarah smiled as the larger puppy tried to chew on the stethoscope tubing. This one's going to be trouble. Strong personality, probably going to test every boundary you set. Thunder actually smiled then, a genuine expression that transformed his entire face. Sounds familiar. As Sarah prepared their first round of vaccinations, she found herself reassessing everything she thought she knew about Jake Morrison. The gentle way he held the puppies during their shots, the careful notes he took about feeding requirements, the questions he asked about their long-term care. This wasn't the distant, emotionally unavailable man Millbrook had learned to expect. "You'll want to bring them back in 2 weeks for their next round of shots," Sarah said, cleaning her stethoscope and preparing the discharge paperwork. "And call me if you have any concerns, any changes in their behavior or appetite." Thunder nodded, already reaching for the carrier he'd improvised from a cardboard box and blankets. "What do I owe you?" Sarah surprised herself with her answer. "Let's call it community service. Just promise me you'll take good care of them." The stethoscope around her neck felt warm as she watched Thunder carefully settle the puppies in their makeshift carrier. Her grandfather would have approved, she thought. He'd always believed that healing happened as much through compassion as through medical expertise. And watching Thunder Morrison discover his capacity for tenderness, Sarah suspected she was witnessing the beginning of a healing that went far deeper than 2 rescued animals. The hand-carved wooden food bowl had taken Thunder 3 evenings to complete, working by lamplight in his garage after the puppies had settled for the night. He'd started with a piece of oak from an old motorcycle crate, something that would have normally ended up as kindling. But as he'd watched the sisters eat from mismatched dishes salvaged from his kitchen, something had stirred in him that demanded better for them. His woodworking skills were rusty, learned decades ago from his grandfather before military service had redirected his hands toward more destructive purposes. But muscle memory proved reliable, and the simple pleasure of creating something beautiful rather than merely functional felt like rediscovering a forgotten language. The bowl emerged slowly from the oak, smooth curves following the natural grain. Sized perfectly for 2 small faces to eat side by side, the larger puppy, whom Thunder had started calling Trouble in his mind, approached everything with fearless curiosity. She investigated every corner of his apartment, chewed on everything within reach, and had already figured out how to escape from 3 different containment systems. Her sister was more cautious, content to observe from safe distances before venturing forward. Their personalities emerged more clearly each day. Trouble would charge headfirst into new experiences, while her sister preferred to let courage come gradually. But when Trouble got into situations beyond her abilities, often involving heights she could climb but not descend, her sister would sit below and cry until Thunder came to investigate. The feeding routine had evolved into something approaching cooperation. Both puppies now recognized the sound of their food being prepared, tiny tails wagging as Thunder warmed their milk and measured their portions into the wooden bowl he'd crafted. They'd learned to wait more or less patiently, while he set their meal down, though Trouble usually dove in before he'd fully straightened up. Thunder found himself talking to them during these daily rituals, his voice taking on a gentleness he hadn't heard from himself in years. He narrated his actions, explained what he was doing and why, told them about his plans for the day. They listened with the serious attention that only very young animals could manage, heads tilted as if genuinely considering his words. The apartment was slowly transforming around their presence. Throw rugs appeared to protect his floors from inevitable accidents. A small heater ensured their corner stayed warm during mountain nights. Toys, improvised from rope and old rags, began accumulating in previously pristine spaces. But the most significant change was in Thunder himself. He caught himself smiling at their antics, laughing when Trouble got herself wedged behind his couch while investigating suspicious sounds. His rigid daily schedule had softened to accommodate feeding times and play sessions. The silence that had once filled his evenings was replaced by the soft sounds of puppy breathing and occasional dream barks. When Mrs. Henderson stopped by to pick up her Honda, she found Thunder sitting on his garage floor, with both puppies tumbling over his outstretched legs. Her eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline as she watched the infamous Thunder Morrison patiently untangle Trouble from his bootlaces, while her sister napped against his thigh. "Well," she said after a long moment, "I never thought I'd see the day." Thunder looked up, suddenly aware of how the scene must appear. "They're just temporary, until I can find them proper homes." Mrs. Henderson's knowing smile suggested she wasn't fooled by his explanation, but she simply nodded and collected her motorcycle keys. "Of course, dear, just temporary." As her car disappeared down his driveway, Thunder looked down at the wooden bowl, now bearing the tiny teeth marks that proved its daily use. He'd carved it with the intention of providing something worthy of the lives he was protecting. But watching the sisters eat from it each day, seeing how they'd claimed it as unquestionably theirs, Thunder was beginning to understand that the bowl represented something larger than craftsmanship. It was the first thing he'd created purely out of love rather than necessity, and its very existence proved that his capacity for tenderness had survived everything he'd believed had destroyed it. The torn motorcycle manual lay in shreds across Thunder's garage floor, its pages scattered like confetti after a particularly destructive celebration. The Harley-Davidson Service Manual, 2019 edition, had been a birthday gift to himself 3 years ago, a pristine reference guide that had helped him through countless repairs. Now it resembled abstract art, courtesy of Trouble's enthusiastic teething session. Thunder stood surveying the damage, hands on his hips, trying to summon appropriate outrage. The manual had cost him $60 and contained information he genuinely needed. But watching Trouble sitting proudly among the debris, a particularly satisfying piece of glossy paper still hanging from her mouth, he found anger frustratingly elusive. "Really?" he asked her, and she responded by wagging her tail and pouncing on another page. The past 2 weeks had been an education in chaos management. His precisely organized tools now required daily searches, often discovered in corners where curious puppies had dragged them. His work schedule, once predictable as sunrise, now bent around feeding times and emergency cleanups. Sleep had become a precious commodity, interrupted by whimpers, bathroom needs, and the occasional middle-of-the-night exploration that resulted in crashes loud enough to wake the dead. The financial reality was becoming impossible to ignore. Puppy food, veterinary bills, and the constant replacement of destroyed items were straining his modest savings. He'd calculated the cost during a sleepless night. At this rate, the puppies would consume his emergency fund within 2 months. But the real challenge wasn't financial. It was the growing attachment that made every rational consideration irrelevant. Thunder had intended to find them homes, had even started drafting advertisements in his head. Good homes with families who understood puppies, who had yards and children and experience with young animals. The problem was that watching Trouble's sister venture outside for the first time, seeing her discover grass and sunshine with wonder that made his chest ache, made the idea of giving them away feel like betrayal. They trusted him completely, followed him everywhere, fell asleep against his legs while he worked. They'd made him the center of their small world, and somewhere along the way, they'd become the center of his. When Sheriff Bradley stopped by to pick up his patrol bike, he found Thunder attempting to work, while both puppies supervised from a makeshift playpen constructed from spare motorcycle parts. "Having some help, I see," Tom observed, watching Trouble try to climb the barrier while her sister discovered the fascinating texture of a spare tire. "They're temporary," Thunder said automatically, the words feeling more hollow each time he spoke them. Tom nodded, with the careful neutrality of a man who'd learned when not to press.
"Course they are.
Just like my wife's temporary flower garden that's been expanding for 15 years. As Tom rode away, Thunder looked down at the destroyed manual and then at Trouble, who was now investigating his bootlaces with the same destructive enthusiasm she'd applied to his documentation. Tomorrow he'd need to order a replacement manual. Tonight he'd have to reorganize his tools again. His orderly life was disappearing one chewed page at a time, but kneeling to gather the scattered papers, feeling Trouble's sister nuzzle against his hand in what might have been sympathy or complicity, Thunder realized that some changes were worth the chaos they brought. The broken fence post lay splintered in the morning grass, its weathered wood finally succumbing to years of Montana winters and the determined excavation efforts of a particularly adventurous golden retriever puppy. Thunder had been meaning to replace that section of fencing for months, but like many maintenance tasks around his property, it had fallen victim to the endless demands of keeping his business running and his own life functional. At 8 weeks old, the puppy he'd started calling Courage had developed an explorer's heart that far exceeded her physical limitations. While her sister preferred the safety of familiar territory, Courage viewed every barrier as a personal challenge. The gap beneath the failing fence post was exactly puppy-sized, an invitation she couldn't resist when Thunder's attention was focused on adjusting the carburetor of Mrs. Peterson's ancient Kawasaki. The sound that alerted him was wrong in a way that made his blood turn cold. Instead of the usual puppy barks and playful growls from the yard, he heard a sharp yelp, followed by silence that stretched too long. Thunder dropped his tools and ran, his boots sliding on the gravel as he rounded the corner of his garage. Courage lay motionless beside the highway, her small body twisted at an angle that made Thunder's military medical training kick in with crystalline clarity. Route 47 wasn't heavily traveled, but the morning commute brought enough traffic to make any animal encounter potentially fatal. The pickup truck that had struck her was already disappearing around the bend. Either unaware of the impact or unwilling to stop, Thunder approached carefully, his hands steady despite the panic clawing at his chest. Courage's breathing was shallow but present, her eyes open but unfocused. Blood seeped from a gash on her left hind leg, and the way she held her front paw suggested additional injuries. He'd seen worse wounds in combat, had treated soldiers under fire with less equipment than he had available now. But this was different. This was Courage. His truck had never started faster or driven more carefully. Thunder cradled the injured puppy against his chest with one hand while steering with the other, talking to her in the calm, steady voice he'd once used to keep wounded soldiers conscious during medevac flights. "Stay with me, girl. We're almost there. Sarah's going to fix you up, and then you're coming home." The veterinary clinic had never seemed so far away, though the drive took less than 10 minutes. Thunder burst through the front door, with Courage wrapped in the same muddy blanket that had first sheltered both puppies, calling for Sarah with an urgency that brought her running from the back office. "Examination table 2, Sarah directed, her professional composure masking whatever surprise she felt at seeing Thunder Morrison on the verge of emotional collapse. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking pulse, pupil response, palpating for internal injuries while Thunder stood frozen beside the table. Broken leg, possible concussion. "But she's stable," Sarah announced, after what felt like hours, but was probably minutes. "She's going to need surgery to set the bone, and we'll want to monitor her overnight for signs of head trauma." Thunder nodded, unable to trust his voice. He'd carried wounded soldiers to safety, had performed emergency medical procedures under enemy fire, had faced death with the stoic acceptance that military training demanded. But watching Sarah prepare Courage for surgery, seeing the tiny body disappear behind the operating room door, stripped away every defense he'd built around his heart. The waiting room had been designed for comfort, but Thunder couldn't sit still. He paced between the chairs and the window, checking his phone for time that seemed to move backward, replaying the morning's events and cataloguing his failures. He should have fixed the fence, should have been watching more carefully, should have known that Courage's adventurous spirit would eventually lead her into danger. When Millbrook's residents began arriving, Thunder barely noticed at first. Mrs. Henderson appeared with coffee and sandwiches he couldn't eat. Sheriff Bradley stopped by during his patrol, staying long enough to hear the surgery update. Pete from the hardware store brought a new fence post and the materials to install it properly, setting them by Thunder's truck without saying a word about payment. By the time Sarah emerged from surgery 3 hours later, the waiting room held half the town. Thunder looked up from hands that had been shaking for the past hour, afraid to read the expression on her face. "She's going to be fine," Sarah said, and Thunder felt something fundamental shift in his chest, a wall cracking that had held for 7 years. "But she's going to need careful monitoring for the next few weeks." "Does the clock care?" Thunder nodded, tears he hadn't shed since Afghanistan finally finding their way down his cheeks. Around him, Millbrook's residents smiled and patted his shoulders. And for the first time since coming home, Thunder Morrison realized he wasn't alone. The glass jar sitting on Murphy's counter had started as a pickle jar, its original label scrubbed away and replaced with a hand-lettered sign that read "Help Thunder's Pup" in Sarah's careful script. Within hours of word spreading about Courage's accident, it had begun filling with crumpled bills and loose change, the physical manifestation of a community that had finally found a way to reach past Thunder Morrison's carefully maintained walls. Patrick Murphy had initiated the collection without consulting anyone, his Irish sensibilities offended by the idea that a man should face veterinary bills alone when he'd done nothing but show kindness to abandoned animals. By lunchtime, the jar held $43 and a handful of coins. By closing time, it contained nearly $200 and a small pile of handwritten notes expressing support and concern. Thunder knew nothing about the collection during those first agonizing hours. He sat in the veterinary clinic's recovery room, watching Courage sleep off the anesthesia while machines monitored her vital signs. Her left hind leg was encased in a bright blue cast that seemed impossibly large for such a small body, and a cone collar prevented her from disturbing the surgical site. But her breathing was steady, and her color was good. Sarah checked on them hourly, her professional demeanor softening each time she found Thunder maintaining his vigil. He'd barely moved from the chair beside Courage's recovery crate, one large finger extended through the bars so the sleeping puppy could sense his presence. The transformation from distant mechanic to devoted caregiver was so complete that Sarah wondered if the rest of Millbrook would recognize him. When Mrs. Henderson arrived with the jar and its contents, Thunder stared at the money as if he'd never seen currency before. The bills had been smoothed and folded with care, accompanied by notes written on everything from napkins to prescription pad pages. "For the pup. She's lucky to have you. Get well soon. Little one, I can't take this," Thunder said, his voice hoarse from hours of worry. "You're not taking it," Mrs. Henderson replied, with the firmness of a woman who'd raised 5 children and buried 2 husbands. "It's being given." "There's a difference." Thunder tried to argue, but Mrs. Henderson's logic proved unassailable. The money wasn't charity, she explained. It was investment. Millbrook had watched Thunder transform from isolated veteran to man capable of such obvious love, and they wanted to protect that transformation. They'd seen him cry in a public waiting room over a wounded animal, had witnessed him discover his capacity for tenderness, and they weren't about to let financial worry steal that discovery away. Sheriff Bradley appeared as evening fell. bringing news that he'd tracked down the driver who'd struck Courage. The man, a traveling salesman from Billings, had genuinely been unaware of the impact. He'd left his contact information and insurance details, along with a check to cover the veterinary expenses and a stuffed animal for Courage's recovery. "Seems like a decent fellow," Tom said, settling into the chair beside Thunder. "Just didn't see her until it was too late. Said to tell you he's got dogs of his own, knows how hard this must be." The gesture of strangers, caring about his pain, struck Thunder as profoundly as the support from his neighbors. For 7 years, he'd believed that his capacity to connect with others had been damaged beyond repair, that the emotional numbness that followed him home from overseas was a permanent condition. But sitting in that recovery room, surrounded by evidence of a community's concern and a stranger's compassion, Thunder felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of himself. When Courage finally woke, her tail managed a weak wag, despite the medications and discomfort. Thunder's finger was the first thing she sought, pressing her small nose against his skin with the absolute trust that had come to define their relationship. Sarah, monitoring from the doorway, watched Thunder's face transform as he spoke softly to the recovering puppy. "Tomorrow we'll take you home," he promised, his voice carrying a certainty that encompassed more than just the immediate future. "Your sister's been worried sick and we've got a proper fence to build." Sarah smiled, thinking about the jar on Murphy's counter and the way Thunder had finally stopped referring to the puppies as temporary arrangements. Sometimes healing happened in emergency rooms under surgical lights, but sometimes it happened in moments of vulnerability, when walls cracked wide enough to let love find its way in. The collection jar would remain on Murphy's counter for another week, continuing to fill with contributions from travelers and locals alike, becoming less about the money and more about the symbol of a community that had learned to see past surfaces to the heart beneath. The medication schedule chart hung on Thunder's refrigerator like a battle plan, its careful handwriting documenting a level of attention to detail that would have impressed his old drill sergeants. Times, dosages, and checkboxes filled the white page in precise columns, each entry completed with the methodical accuracy Thunder applied to his most complex mechanical repairs. But this chart wasn't about motorcycle engines or transmission assemblies. It was about keeping a golden retriever puppy comfortable and healing. Courage's recovery demanded a complete restructuring of Thunder's daily routine. Every 4 hours, pain medication. Twice daily, antibiotic doses hidden in small portions of soft food. 3 times each day, careful examination of the surgical site for signs of infection or swelling. The cast needed to stay dry, which meant monitoring every trip outside and protecting it during the mountain's frequent rain showers. Thunder had taken time off from his garage for the first time in 3 years, posting a handwritten sign that read, "Closed for family emergency" on his front door. The word family had been added after he'd crossed out personal, a small revision that carried enormous meaning for a man who'd lived alone for so long. Hope, Courage's sister, had responded to the crisis with the intuitive understanding that sometimes connected animals more deeply than humans. She seemed to sense that her sibling needed extra protection, positioning herself as a furry guardian who rarely left Courage's side. When Courage slept, Hope slept pressed against her. When Courage attempted to move beyond the restrictions of her recovery area, Hope would gently but firmly redirect her back to safety. The apartment had been reorganized around Courage's limitations. Thunder had constructed a recovery pen in his living room, using spare motorcycle parts and cushions to create a space large enough for both puppies, but secure enough to prevent Courage from attempting any adventures that might compromise her healing. A baby gate, purchased from Peterson's Hardware along with the rest of the new fence materials, blocked access to the stairs that led to his garage. Feeding had become a careful choreography. Courage's medications needed to be administered with food, but Hope's healthy appetite meant separating them during meals to ensure each puppy received exactly what she needed. Thunder found himself sitting cross-legged on his floor twice daily, monitoring both sisters while they ate, talking to them in the gentle voice that had become second nature. The chart on his refrigerator grew more detailed each day as Thunder documented Courage's progress. Weight measurements, appetite notes, mobility observations, mood assessments. Sarah had taught him to recognize the signs of healthy healing versus complications, and Thunder applied that knowledge with the intensity he'd once reserved for survival training. But the most significant change wasn't visible on any chart. Thunder had begun talking to the puppies about everything: his plans for their fence, his concerns about their future, his memories of their mother, and the rainy morning that had brought them together. Conversations he'd never been able to have with humans flowed easily with two small animals who listened without judgment and responded with unconditional acceptance. When Mrs. Henderson stopped by with another casserole, she found Thunder reading motorcycle repair manuals aloud to both puppies, his voice providing a steady soundtrack to their afternoon nap. "Seems like you're settling into the routine," she observed, smiling at the sight of the medication chart and the carefully organized recovery area. Thunder looked up from his manual, Courage sleeping against his leg, while Hope used his free hand as a pillow. "They make it easy," he said, then paused as he realized the truth of that statement. "Actually, they make everything easier." Mrs. Henderson nodded with the wisdom of someone who'd spent decades watching people discover what truly mattered. The medication chart might document Courage's healing, but anyone with eyes could see that the real recovery happening in Thunder Morrison's apartment went much deeper than broken bones and surgical repairs. As she drove away, Mrs. Henderson reflected on how sometimes the best healing happened when people stopped trying to fix themselves and started taking care of something else instead. The crayon drawing was wrinkled from being clutched in small hands during the walk from town, its bright colors depicting three figures that required some imagination to interpret. Thunder stood at his front door, looking down at 8-year-old Emma Rodriguez, who held the artwork with the serious pride of a child presenting her masterpiece to an adult she deemed worthy of such a gift. "That's you," Emma explained, pointing to a large figure rendered in black crayon with what appeared to be a cape. "And those are your super puppies. My mom said you saved them from being dead, so I made you all superheroes." Thunder accepted the drawing with the careful reverence it deserved, studying the crayon figures that bore only passing resemblance to reality, but captured something more important than accuracy. In Emma's artistic interpretation, he wasn't a scarred veteran struggling with isolation. He was a hero, cape flying, flanked by two golden animals with oversized smiles and what might have been wings. "This is beautiful." "Emma, thank you," Emma beamed, then leaned closer with the conspiratorial air of someone sharing important intelligence. "My mom wants to know if we can visit the puppies sometime. She said you might not mind now, since you let Mrs. Henderson bring you casseroles and stuff." Word of Thunder's transformation had spread through Millbrook with the efficiency that only small-town networks could achieve. Stories of his emotional breakdown at the veterinary clinic, his round-the-clock care during Courage's recovery, and his newfound willingness to accept help had created a narrative that the community found both surprising and deeply satisfying. Sarah had encouraged him to allow visitors, arguing that socialization would benefit both puppies and probably Thunder himself. The first tentative visits had felt awkward, Thunder uncertain how to navigate the sudden interest in his private life. But watching children's faces light up when they met Hope and Courage, seeing elderly residents find comfort in petting the gentle animals, had gradually worn down his resistance. The visits had evolved into informal therapy sessions without anyone planning such a thing. Courage, despite her caste and mobility limitations, seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of human need. She would settle quietly beside anyone who appeared sad or stressed, offering the simple comfort of her presence. Hope, more energetic but equally intuitive, specialized in making people laugh with her playful antics and determined efforts to steal attention from her more serious sister. Thunder found himself serving as an unlikely host, making coffee for adults. While children played carefully with the puppies in the living room, he'd converted into a recovery space. Conversations flowed more easily than he'd expected, neighbors sharing their own stories of pets and loss. Older residents reminiscing about animals they'd loved decades ago. The change in how Millbrook saw him was reflected in small gestures throughout the week. Pete from the hardware store had stopped by with a bag of premium puppy treats, refusing payment and staying for an hour to tell stories about the hunting dogs he'd raised in his younger years. The mailman now knocked on the door to ask about Courage's progress, instead of simply leaving packages by the garage. Even Sheriff Bradley had started including Thunder's property in his regular patrol route, stopping to check on the family's well-being. But the most significant change was internal. Thunder caught himself looking forward to these visits, planning activities that would be safe for Courage but entertaining for their guests. He'd moved his woodworking station into the living room so he could craft simple toys for the puppies while maintaining conversations with visitors. The drawing from Emma now held a place of honor on his refrigerator, next to Courage's medication chart and a growing collection of get-well cards from children throughout the area. Each piece of artwork depicted the same basic theme: Thunder and his puppies as heroes, protectors, or magical beings capable of extraordinary things. Standing in his living room, watching Hope demonstrate her latest trick for a group of delighted visitors, while Courage supervised from her recovery bed, Thunder realized that Emma's artistic interpretation might not be as fanciful as he'd first thought. He hadn't grown a cape or developed supernatural powers, but he had discovered something equally transformative: the ability to be the center of something good, something that brought joy and healing to others simply by existing. The folded letter had lived in Thunder's desk drawer for 3 years, its edges softened from handling but never opened. The return address was written in handwriting he recognized but hadn't seen since his daughter's high school graduation. Jessica Morrison Chen, 2847 Maple Street, Portland, Oregon. The postmark dated it from just after his last deployment, when the space between father and daughter had grown too wide for either of them to bridge. Thunder discovered the letter while searching for Courage's vaccination records, his fingers automatically recognizing the familiar weight of unread words. He'd moved it from apartment to apartment, deployment to deployment, telling himself he was saving it for when he was ready to face whatever Jessica had needed to say. But readiness, he was learning, was a luxury that might never arrive. Sitting cross-legged on his living room floor with both puppies napping against his legs, Thunder found himself studying the envelope with new eyes. Courage's accident had stripped away so many of his careful defenses, had forced him to confront the depth of love he was capable of feeling. If he could love 2 abandoned animals enough to cry in public waiting rooms, what did that say about his capacity to love the daughter he'd failed so completely? The nightmares had been returning more frequently since the accident, triggered by the familiar combination of emergency medical situations and overwhelming helplessness. Thunder would wake in cold sweats, memories of IED explosions mixing with the sound of Courage's impact on Route 47. The difference was that now, instead of lying alone in darkness until dawn, he had company. Both puppies seemed to sense his distress during these episodes. Hope would position herself across his chest, her warm weight serving as an anchor to the present moment. Courage, despite her limited mobility, would somehow maneuver herself close enough that her breathing synchronized with his racing heartbeat until both found a steadier rhythm. Sarah had noticed the signs during one of Courage's follow-up appointments, her veterinary training extending to recognizing trauma responses in humans as well as animals. She'd mentioned PTSD almost casually, discussing it the way she might address any other treatable condition. But Thunder had deflected the conversation with the skill of years of practice. Sometimes healing happens in stages, she'd said, watching Thunder's gentle handling of Courage during the examination. Sometimes taking care of something else teaches us how to take care of ourselves. The puppies had become his emotional barometers, reflecting his moods and responding to his needs with an intuition that humbled him daily. When anxiety made his hands shake, Hope would bring him one of her toys, insisting on games that required focus and engagement. When memories threatened to pull him into dark places, Courage would somehow position herself where his hands could find her fur, grounding him in the immediate reality of her trust. But the letter remained unopened, a tangible reminder of the relationships he'd abandoned when emotional connection became too dangerous to risk. Thunder had convinced himself that staying away from Jessica was protection, that his damaged state made him unfit for fatherhood. But watching his own capacity for tenderness emerge through caring for the puppies, he was beginning to question the narrative he'd constructed about his limitations. The puppies didn't care about his military service or his emotional availability. They didn't analyze his responses or measure his adequacy as a caregiver. They simply accepted his love and returned it unconditionally, creating a safe space where healing could happen naturally. Thunder folded the letter carefully and returned it to the drawer, but its presence felt different now. Not a reminder of failure, but a possibility waiting for him to become brave enough to explore it. The same courage that had prompted him to rescue 2 abandoned animals might eventually extend to rescuing the relationship with his daughter that he'd been too afraid to fight for. For now, though it was enough to sit with Hope and Courage, letting their unconditional acceptance slowly teach him that love didn't require perfection, only presence and the willingness to try. The 2 matching leather collars lay on Thunder's workbench, their surfaces still warm from the careful attention he'd spent crafting them over the past 3 evenings. Each collar bore a brass nameplate engraved with careful precision, Courage on the smaller one, Hope on the slightly larger. The leather itself came from an old motorcycle jacket he'd never quite been able to throw away, transformed now into something that would keep his girls safe and announce to the world that they belonged to someone who cared enough to create something beautiful for them. The decision to name them officially had come during Courage's 3rd week of recovery, when it became impossible to maintain the fiction that these were temporary arrangements. Thunder had spent months referring to them as the puppies or the girls, avoiding names that would make the attachment feel permanent. But watching Courage determinedly navigate her world despite the cast, seeing Hope's unwavering loyalty to her injured sister, had made it clear that they'd already chosen their names through their actions. Courage had earned her name through pure, stubborn determination. Despite the cast that made walking awkward, and the cone collar that complicated eating and drinking, she approached each day with the same fearless enthusiasm that had led her under the broken fence. She'd figured out how to climb onto Thunder's couch despite her limitations, had mastered the art of opening doors with her good front paw, and had appointed herself the official greeter for anyone who visited their home. Hope had proven equally worthy of her name, but in subtler ways. She'd become Thunder's emotional compass, somehow sensing his moods and responding with exactly the right combination of playfulness or comfort. When his nightmares woke him, Hope would be waiting with a toy to redirect his attention. When visitors arrived and Thunder felt overwhelmed by social interaction, Hope would create gentle distractions that gave him space to recover. The collar-making process had become a meditation for Thunder, his hands working the leather, while his mind processed the magnitude of the commitment he was making. These weren't just accessories. They were declarations of ownership, responsibility, and love. Once he buckled these collars around their necks, there would be no more pretending this was a temporary situation. Sarah had stopped by during the final evening of his work, ostensibly to check on Courage's healing progress, but clearly curious about the leather project that had consumed his attention. She'd watched him stamp the final letters into Hope's nameplate, her veterinary eye noting the precision and care that went into every detail. "They're beautiful," she'd said, running her fingers along the smooth leather. "Your girls are going to look very official." The phrase, "your girls," had settled into Thunder's chest with surprising warmth. For weeks, he'd been dancing around the reality of ownership, referring to them as strays he was helping or animals he was fostering. But Sarah's casual acknowledgement of what everyone could see made it impossible to maintain those careful distinctions. The next morning, Thunder had knelt in his living room with both collars, calling the puppies to him with the solemnity of someone performing a ceremony. Courage had submitted to her collar with patient dignity, as if she understood the significance of the moment. Hope had wiggled with excitement, somehow sensing that this was an important development, even if she couldn't grasp the details. Standing back to admire his work, Thunder felt a fundamental shift in how he saw his life. The apartment that had been a bachelor's retreat was now a family home. The routine that had revolved around his solitary needs now centered on the well-being of 3 beings instead of 1. The future that had stretched ahead in predictable isolation now held the uncertainty and joy that came with loving something more than himself. The collars gleamed in the afternoon light, their brass nameplates catching the sun like small beacons. Courage and Hope wore them with the unconscious pride of animals who knew they were treasured. And Thunder found himself making mental plans for dog parks and training classes and all the adventures that lay ahead for his officially recognized family. The legal notice arrived on a Tuesday morning with the impersonal efficiency of bureaucratic machinery, its official letterhead and formal language creating an immediate knot of anxiety in Thunder's stomach. The document, signed by someone calling himself the Millbrook Code. Enforcement officer detailed multiple violations of residential zoning ordinances that Thunder had never known existed, failure to obtain proper permits for animal housing structures, read the first violation, referring to the elaborate doghouse Thunder had built in his backyard. The structure was a masterpiece of function and comfort, complete with insulated walls, a raised floor to prevent moisture problems, and windows positioned to catch the morning sun. Thunder had spent weeks designing and building it, consulting with Sarah about proper ventilation and drainage, creating something worthy of the 2 lives that depended on his care. The second violation cited excessive noise complaints from neighboring properties, a charge that made Thunder's jaw clench with frustrated disbelief. Courage and Hope were among the quietest dogs he'd ever encountered, their barking limited to announcing visitors or expressing excitement during play sessions. The third violation proved even more bewildering. Operation of unauthorized animal therapy facility. Thunder read that final charge 3 times before its implications became clear. The visits from townspeople, the children who came to play with the puppies, the elderly residents who found comfort in petting Hope and Courage, had somehow been interpreted as running an unlicensed business. What felt like community and healing had been reduced to regulatory violations and zoning infractions. The notice demanded immediate compliance with all regulations or face fines, totaling $1,500, with additional penalties accruing daily until violations were corrected. At the bottom, in smaller print, Thunder found the real threat. Continued non-compliance may result in removal of animals from the property and dissolution of unauthorized animal housing. The possibility of losing Courage and Hope hit Thunder like a physical blow, making his hands shake as he read the legal language that reduced his family to unauthorized animals and zoning violations. Someone was using bureaucratic weapons to attack the life he'd built, the healing he'd found, the community connections that had finally given his existence meaning beyond mere survival. His first instinct was to call Sarah, but the phone rang before he could reach for it. Sheriff Bradley's voice carried the weariness of a man delivering bad news he didn't personally support. "Jake, I just got word about the notice you received. Want you to know this didn't come from my office. Who's behind it?" Thunder asked, his military training automatically shifting into tactical assessment mode. Code enforcement is handled at the county level, but the complaints had to come from somewhere local. Someone who knows your property, knows about the visitors. Tom paused, and Thunder could hear the reluctance in his voice. I got a feeling this is about more than zoning violations. Thunder's mind catalogued potential enemies, but the list was frustratingly short. He'd kept to himself for 7 years, had avoided the kind of conflicts that created lasting grudges. His only recent change had been opening his home to visitors, allowing the community to see a softer side of the man they'd known only as a distant mechanic. The legal notice lay on his kitchen table like a declaration of war, its formal language threatening to dismantle everything he'd built with courage and hope. Thunder had faced enemy combatants armed with explosives and automatic weapons, but this attack felt more insidious, more personal. Someone was using the law itself as a weapon, hiding behind regulations and bureaucracy to destroy what they couldn't confront directly. Looking through his window at the doghouse he'd built with such care, at the yard where courage was learning to walk normally again, while hope supervised her sister's progress, Thunder felt something familiar and dangerous stirring in his chest. This wasn't just about zoning violations or noise complaints. This was about people who couldn't tolerate the transformation they'd witnessed, who preferred the isolated, damaged version of Jake Morrison to the man who'd learned to love again. The war for his family was about to begin, and Thunder Morrison had never lost a battle that truly mattered. The petition lay spread across 3 tables at Murphy's Diner, its pages already bearing the signatures of nearly every adult in Millbrook, and a growing collection of children's names written in careful block letters. Patrick Murphy had organized the effort within hours of learning about Thunder's legal troubles, his Irish temper thoroughly roused by what he considered an attack on decency itself. "This is about more than zoning," Murphy declared to the growing crowd that had gathered for an impromptu town meeting. "This is about who we are as a community. Jake Morrison rescued those animals when nobody else would. He's opened his home to our children, brought comfort to our elderly, and shown us all what real kindness looks like. Now some bureaucrat wants to tear that apart over paperwork." The response had been immediate and overwhelming. Mrs. Henderson had arrived with a shoebox full of receipts documenting her contributions to Thunder's veterinary bills. Pete from the hardware store brought photographs of the doghouse construction, proving the quality and safety of Thunder's work. Even the mailman had contributed testimony about the positive changes he'd witnessed in Thunder's demeanor and community involvement. Sarah sat at the corner table, drafting a letter that combined her veterinary expertise with legal arguments about the therapeutic value of human-animal interactions. Her professional credentials lent weight to claims that might otherwise sound sentimental, transforming community observations into documented behavioral science. "These animals aren't just pets," she wrote. "They're providing measurable benefits to community mental health, particularly among our elderly residents and children who struggle with social anxiety. Any action that separates them from their current environment would constitute a public health concern." Sheriff Bradley had spent the morning making phone calls to county officials, using his law enforcement connections to trace the source of the complaints. His investigation revealed a pattern that made his jaw clench with professional anger. The violations had been filed by someone using a post office box and providing no legitimate contact information. "This is harassment disguised as regulation," he told Murphy. "Someone's hiding behind anonymous complaints to cause trouble for Jake. That's not law enforcement. That's cowardice." By afternoon, the petition contained over 200 signatures, including names from neighboring towns who'd heard about Thunder's situation through the informal networks that connected rural communities. Each signature represented not just support for Thunder, but recognition that attacks on community kindness threatened everyone's security. The most powerful addition came from 8-year-old Emma Rodriguez, whose crayon drawing still held a place of honor on Thunder's refrigerator. Her carefully printed statement read, "Mr. Thunder saved the puppies, and they make everyone happy. Taking them away would be mean and stupid and wrong." Murphy had called an official town meeting for the following evening, planning to present the petition and organize testimony to county officials. The response had grown beyond simple support into something approaching civic mobilization, with residents volunteering everything from legal research to media outreach, standing behind his diner counter, watching neighbors who rarely agreed on anything unite around protecting Thunder's right to care for his animals. Murphy felt the satisfaction of a man who'd chosen the right battle. This wasn't about zoning regulations or bureaucratic procedures. This was about defending the kind of community they wanted to live in, one where transformation and healing were celebrated rather than punished. The petition continued to grow throughout the day, its pages becoming a physical manifestation of Millbrook's values and priorities. By evening, it would represent not just support for Thunder Morrison, but a declaration that some things mattered more than regulations, that love and kindness deserved protection even when they didn't fit neatly into legal categories. Sarah's grandmother's ring caught the afternoon light as she held it between her fingers, its simple gold band and modest diamond reflecting decades of love and commitment. The ring had been passed down through 3 generations of strong women, each of whom had faced their own challenges and emerged with grace intact. Now, sitting in Thunder's living room with Courage sleeping across her lap and Hope investigating a new toy nearby, Sarah found herself contemplating its next chapter. The past weeks had transformed her understanding of Jake Morrison in ways that surprised her professional objectivity. She'd watched him navigate Courage's medical crisis with the steady competence of someone accustomed to emergency situations, but also with a tenderness that revealed depths she'd never suspected. His questions during veterinary visits demonstrated not just concern, but genuine desire to understand every aspect of his animal's well-being. More significantly, she'd witnessed his gradual emergence from the emotional isolation that had defined his place in Millbrook's social landscape. The man who'd once avoided eye contact during brief professional interactions now engaged in lengthy conversations about everything from puppy training techniques to his memories of overseas deployment. The walls he'd maintained so carefully were finally permeable, allowing genuine connection to develop. Their relationship had evolved naturally through shared concern for the animals. Evening visits to check on Courage's recovery had extended into dinners, conversations that began with medical updates and evolved into personal histories neither had shared before. Sarah had learned about Thunder's military service, his struggles with survivor's guilt, his failed attempts at maintaining relationships with women who couldn't understand his emotional distance. Thunder had discovered Sarah's own challenges, the isolation of being a young, professional woman in a male-dominated field, her struggle to establish credibility in a community that still questioned whether someone who looked like her could handle large animals with the same competence as the gruff older veterinarians they were accustomed to. They'd found common ground in their shared experience of being outsiders who'd gradually earned acceptance through competence and persistence. The ring represented a decision Sarah had been avoiding for weeks. Her grandmother had given it to her with specific instructions. Don't settle for someone who can't see your strength. Wait for the man who makes you want to be even stronger. Thunder had proven himself worthy of that standard in ways Sarah was still cataloguing. She'd watched him advocate fiercely for his animal's welfare, navigating bureaucratic challenges with the same determination he'd once applied to military objectives. She'd seen him accept help from his community without losing his independence, learning to be vulnerable without becoming weak. Most importantly, she'd witnessed his capacity for growth, his willingness to examine his own limitations and work to overcome them. The legal challenges facing Thunder had clarified Sarah's feelings with uncomfortable precision. The thought of him losing courage and hope, of watching his newfound openness retreat behind defensive walls, made her realize how deeply invested she'd become in his happiness. But more than that, it had shown her that Thunder was worth fighting for, worth the risk that serious commitment always entailed. When Thunder returned from his afternoon visit to Murphy's diner, where the petition supporting his case continued to grow, Sarah was waiting with the ring box open on his coffee table. His expression shifted from confusion to understanding as he took in the significance of the moment. "Sarah," he began, but she held up her hand to stop him. "I'm not asking for an answer today," she said, her voice carrying the gentle firmness that made her so effective with both animals and their owners. "I'm just letting you know that when you're ready, when this legal situation is resolved and you can think clearly about the future, I'd like to be part of it." Thunder sat beside her on the couch, careful not to disturb Courage, and reached for Sarah's hand. The ring caught the light again as their fingers intertwined, and for the first time in years, Thunder Morrison allowed himself to imagine a future that included not just survival, but actual happiness. "I'd like that too," he said quietly, and Sarah smiled as she watched him begin to believe that he deserved the love she was offering. The group photo had been taken spontaneously during the community barbecue that Murphy organized to show support for Thunder's legal battle. In it, Thunder stood in the center of a crowd of neighbors, Sarah beside him, with her hand resting comfortably on his arm, while Courage and Hope sat at their feet like furry ambassadors. The camera had captured a moment of genuine happiness, Thunder's smile reaching his eyes in a way that would have been impossible just months earlier. The barbecue itself had been Murphy's idea, a way to demonstrate community solidarity while celebrating the positive changes that had transformed not just Thunder, but Millbrook itself. Tables loaded with covered dishes stretched across the diner's parking lot, while children played supervised games with Hope, who'd appointed herself the official entertainment coordinator for anyone under the age of 12. Courage, still favoring her healing leg but no longer restricted by the cast, had stationed herself near the elderly residents who'd claimed a shaded area beside Murphy's building. Her intuitive understanding of human need had grown more sophisticated during her recovery, and she seemed to sense which visitors required gentle comfort versus energetic distraction. The photograph captured more than just a community gathering. It documented Thunder's complete integration into Millbrook's social fabric, his transformation from isolated outsider to beloved neighbor. But for Thunder himself, looking at the image later that evening, it represented something even more significant, proof that he belonged somewhere, that his presence contributed to something larger than his own survival. Sarah had suggested therapy during one of their evening conversations, approaching the subject with the same gentle persistence she used when convincing anxious animals to accept medical treatment. Thunder's initial resistance had been automatic, years of military conditioning insisting that emotional problems were personal weaknesses to be conquered through discipline and determination. But watching Courage navigate her physical recovery with patience and determination, accepting help when she needed it, and celebrating small victories along the way, had given Thunder a new perspective on healing. If a small animal could face her limitations honestly and work systematically toward improvement, perhaps human healing deserved the same practical approach. Dr. Martinez, the counselor Sarah recommended, specialized in military trauma and understood the specific challenges that veterans faced when transitioning between war and civilian life. His office was comfortable without being soft, professional without feeling clinical, and his direct communication style appealed to Thunder's preference for straightforward conversation. The early sessions had been difficult, requiring Thunder to articulate experiences he'd spent years avoiding. But Dr. Martinez had encouraged him to view therapy the same way he approached mechanical problems: systematic diagnosis, identification of damaged components, and methodical repair of what could be fixed while learning to work around what couldn't. Thunder had begun to understand that his emotional numbness hadn't been protection, but a form of damage that prevented him from accessing his own capacity for connection. The puppies had accidentally bypassed his defenses by requiring care that couldn't be provided from a distance. forcing him to engage emotionally in ways that gradually restored his ability to feel without being overwhelmed. The group photo now held a place of honor on Thunder's mantelpiece. Beside the children's drawings and get-well cards that documented his journey from isolation to integration. Looking at it reminded him that healing wasn't a solitary endeavor, that the community he'd tried so hard to avoid had ultimately provided the context for his recovery. Sarah often found him studying the photograph during quiet moments, tracing the faces of neighbors who'd become friends, children who sought him out for stories and advice, elderly residents who'd adopted him as a surrogate grandson. The image proved that transformation was possible, that damaged people could find their way back to wholeness when they were willing to accept help and patient enough to let healing happen naturally. For Thunder, the photograph represented the life he'd never believed he deserved, surrounded by people who cared about his well-being and animals who depended on his love. It was evidence that sometimes the best healing happened not through forgetting the past, but through building a future worth living for.